Afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing today? My name is Dan. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. We're in season 2 of our series on the great jazz labels of the 50s and into the 60s. Today we're going to discuss Atlantic in the late 1950s. We talked about in part 1 the forming of the label and how surprisingly Atlantic had some really cutting-edge recording, including Pithecanthropus erectus in the early to mid-50s. We'll see that continue here some in this series. Atlantic truly runs a wide range. We discussed how, on part 1, Atlantic has an 8000 series running simultaneously to the 1200 series. And the 8000 series is going to be much more pop and R&B based, your Arethas, your Ray Charles, Chris Connor. But the 1200 series was going to be more dedicated to jazz, but it's still a really wide swath of jazz. And you're going to get Chris Connor and Ray Charles here as well, more jazz influenced. To show you just some of the real diversity here, we get some Dixieland era stuff like the great Wilbert of Paris, who has a lot of records on the first 150 Atlantic releases. He has a lot of stuff. It's high quality stuff. It's good sounding Dixieland jazz. I've always been a fan of his stuff. And you can find those old original pressings for fairly next to nothing, $5, $6, $8, which is always worth it for an old Atlantic. I think Atlantic records sound pretty good. Some people complain about Tom Dowd. I don't know. They sound fine to me. I'm more into the spirit and the soul of the music than I am about breaking down the sound of it anyway, so you'll get that from different people than me. As for the artists here at Atlantic, it's white, it's black, there's some Italians, they mixed it up. Certainly not the pure documentation of the other New York labels like the Prestige, the Riverside, and Blue Note. But it's not just a white affair like Bethlehem is quite the same either. This is much more of a mixed affair. I don't think you're going to get the watered down stuff that Savoy puts out. This is pretty solid recordings, pretty solid studio sessions that were designated to be albums. Without messing any more time, we're going to look at some of the singers that riddle the 1200 series. Bobby Short has a bunch. We're actually listening to a Bobby Scott record who has a number of 10 inches on Bethlehem before he went to Atlantic. This Ruth Brown record, real bluesy. Chris Connor, as I said, she has records on 1200 and the 8000 series. Another Chris Connor record. Laverne Baker, blues, gospel, jazz. Francis Wayne. The great Al Hibbler, who sings with Ellington. Some of my favorite songs. So there's quite a bit of vocal stuff, but it's all of a fairly high quality. Slide Hampton has a couple great records here in this section of what's going on in Atlantic. Jimmy Joffrey has a couple of great records here, a great player. Dizzy Gillespie has a weird session here. I think it's a live recording from Europe. Don't know too much about it, to be honest. Lee Konitz has a couple of records here. They're not afraid to do West Coast guys. Here's Teddy Charles. There's a couple of records on Atlantic. This Art Blakey record with Thelonious Monk, kind of a weird, how'd this end up on Atlantic? I don't remember the story. It's a great recording, great album. Bob Bruckermeyer, who has stuff on almost every label, it seems like. More Jimmy Joffrey. Philly Joe Jones, the great drummer, has a couple of solo records here on Atlantic that are tough to come by. Of course, you can't really talk about Atlantic records in the late 50s without talking about the Modern Jazz Quartet. These four cats put out a lot of records on Atlantic for the next 10, 20 years, including the members of the band, Milt Jackson, John Lewis. That's a great John Lewis record. I like John Lewis. I think he's a very intelligent player. I feel like he's very cerebral, like he's got thoughts going on that he's expressing as he's playing and as he's thinking. But it's not just like technical, it's improvised thought. You know what I mean? There's improvised feeling, but he's improvised thought. He's thinking as he's playing, and he's expressing things from the soul that sounds a certain amount of despondency and despair and betrayal. That's a nice little record by the MJQ. They have a lot of stuff. MJQ records will never cost you too much. I think they're always worth $5, $8, $10 myself. Milt Jackson, though, he has a number of records here on Atlantic with Ray Charles. He has one with Coltrane a little later on, and here's one with Coleman Hawkins. I can't say enough about Milt Jackson's solo records on Atlantic. They're great. They always jam. The great Joe Castro, the piano player, died really young. Has a couple of real nice records here on the early late 50s Atlantic stuff. The Jazz Modes, Julius Watkins and Charlie Rouse, have a couple records here on the late 50s on Atlantic. I'm really a fan of that. The French horn's a unique sound in jazz. You don't get to hear that very often. So again, you're seeing Atlantic has a wide swath that it's willing to harvest in jazz musicians and say, yeah, let's see what you guys can come up with. Of course, Ray Charles has a number of hits on the 8000 series, but he's also doing great stuff here in the 1200 series. And this stuff, it cooks, man. You know, Ray was a player. Ray was a great singer. Ray was a great pop star, but Ray was also a great player. And the jazz musicians all respected Ray at a high level. And he was not just given these token jazz recordings. He was a player worthy of those sessions. But to speak about what Atlantic was doing here in the late 50s, we're going to go back to three of the giants in jazz. Mingus is still here, and he's making some fairly unique, compositionally challenging, Ellington would be proud jazz recordings. They're not elemental, they're not basic. It's Mingus. And Mingus's Atlantic stuff is so ahead of what's happening most other places in jazz and most other jazz labels. Again, Bruno gets you the nod because of that unity and that powerful voice of a people. But the free reign that Atlantic gave some of these musicians at this point, Ornette Coleman, and Ornette's a very polarizing figure. He's kind of where jazz really separates in two different directions. And I love Ornette on certain days. Other days it's not in my vein at all. But if I'm going to listen to Ornette, it's going to be one of these two almost for sure. It's free jazz. And I think the innovations that Ornette made opened up the floodgates to a lot of guys who were just kicking the bucket. They probably couldn't play, and free jazz gave them a license to play. I can squawk and hunk anything now, and I'm free. Get out of here with that shit. That's not me. I like melody. I like arrangement. I like there to be a focus on what's happening. I like to feel a unity of spirit on my team. I want to feel the cohesion of us heading in the same direction, emotionally, spiritually, philosophically. And free is six cats talking different directions, different languages. These are great records and they're very important, but much of what follows after this for me is not important in the jazz canon for my taste. And I think it turns more people off jazz than it brings in. And then last of all, one of the great jazz recordings of all time here in 1958, Giant Steps. And Coltrane is one of those guys that can be musically innovative, numerically and constructively unique and creative and innovative, but still doesn't alienate his listener. And that's a tough thing to do. It's a tough thing to be different and overanalyzing the music to the point of disseminating it, but still making it accessible for people. And I think Coltrane's spirituality, I think Coltrane's intensity, I think his genuineness, all that helps convey whatever he's trying to do and makes it almost always come together. And Giant Steps, Spiral, Countdown, a lot of the songs on that record, the tempos are blitzkrieg fast. It's a short record, it blows by you. It doesn't even hit you how interesting and complex it is the first few times because it's such a blur of constant change and innovation and sound and a storm of... It's pretty brilliant. It's a landmark record for a lot of reasons. Most saxophone players today, when they want to show they can play, will try to break out Giant Steps. But the playing aspect of it alone, there's an intensity on that record that speaks about a movement and the cutting edge of that movement. And Coltrane was really pushing the boundaries, of course, for jazz and for music across all boundaries. And it's something that I think most of his disciples never quite grasped, was that integrity and the listenability and to be able to communicate with your audience. And Coltrane was always able to do that up into probably some of that mid-60s impulse stuff, where I think even Coltrane's just at that point trying to cleanse himself of this world. He probably recognized there were some health issues setting in, and his path and time wasn't long. And I think he was just trying to make peace and fight all the demons that he could at that point. But up until 64, no matter what Coltrane was doing, there was always some aspect of it that even a non-jazz head could feel and be drawn in by it. Whether he's doing My Favorite Things or doing A Love Supreme, whether he's doing Giant Steps or Crescent, Africa Brass, there's just an intensity of spirit and an honest communication with the cosmos and the gods, trying to understand his place within this cosmos. And I think that's what translates to people who don't even maybe understand it, but they still can feel something from him that's powerful. And I think Coltrane's a very unique player across all boundaries of music. He really speaks for all mankind and questions the creator for all of us. That's a pretty special thing. So, again, here at Atlantic in the late 50s, it's a pretty wide swath of things, and it's a pretty impressive catalog. I don't have all of it, but I have most of it there. It's almost always reasonably priced, so you can pick it up when you see it. And kudos to Atlantic for being willing to take some of the chances they took with Mingus and Ornette and Coltrane. And enough said about Atlantic. We're going to come back next week, where I think we're going to tackle... I gotta check my book. I'm not even sure. We might be talking about Impulse next week, which shows up in the scene here in 1960. But y'all have a great week. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.